Okay, so in the last part of the tutorial we looked at allowing the user to register. However, now we have to actually allow the user to log in. So let's go ahead and open up login.php in our text editor, and we need to add some more code here that's going to actually allow the login to be processed. So the code is going to come just after here, and the reason for this is that we check if the user is logged in. We output hello, which will later be outputting the user's name as well. Otherwise we display the login form here, and then what we can do is underneath here we can create a check to see if the user has actually submitted the form. What we can then do is validate the input, check if the email and password combination are correct, and then we can actually log the user in. So we're going to be using the same validation that we used in the register.php file, and we're going to be holding all of the errors in an array. So the first thing we need to do is actually take into account if the user has submitted the form. So we need to use isSet to check if each form field has been set. So we use isSet and we say $_post, and inside there this is set to login email. We have login email here, which is where the user would enter their email address. We then have $_post login password. So once these have been checked, we can just say echo out hello for now. Let's go back to our page and test this out. So if I was to click login, you can see that we get this OK confirmation message just here. However, obviously we need to go ahead and actually check whether the fields firstly are empty. We need to check for a valid email address, and then go on to check that the user and password combinations exist in the database. So the first thing we want to do is actually store the posted login and posted email and password into their own variables. So we create a new variable called login email, and this is again equal to $_post and then login_email. We then have login password, which is equal to $_post login password. What we can then do is come down here, we create again our errors array, so that's just errors equals array with a parenthesis at the end. We come down and we say if empty, so exactly like we did in our registration, and we check the emptiness or not emptiness of the email address that's been entered by the user or not entered. We then say to check for the password as well. So essentially just checking for both fields, and again we use the OR operator in the middle to check if either one are empty. Now if these are empty, we can add an element to this array, so we have errors equals, and we'll just say username, or sorry, email and password required. Otherwise we can come into a completely different block, so assuming that the user has typed the email address and password in, or something in the text fields, we can then go on to make additional checks. Now the first check we want to take place is the check for the login and password to match something that exists in the database. So we can go ahead and create a variable called login, and that's going to be equal to login_check, and then in here we need to feed in two variables. Now you might notice this function from user.func.php where we feed in an email and a password, and this is going to handle the sanitization of the email and the password to ensure that SQL injection is as limited as possible, and then this is going to return as well the user ID of the user, which we can then actually use to log the user in. Like we did in register, we popped that into the session. So let's go back over to our login.php page. We need to feed in login email and login password. So assuming that this comes back with an integer, which is the user's ID, we can actually just echo out this login, and this is just for testing purposes, so we can see that we're retrieving the correct value when we type a username and a password combination. So let's go over to user.func.php and we can go ahead and actually write out this login check function. So obviously, importantly, the first thing we need to do is sanitize this data. So we reset the variable email, and that's equal to the function MySQL, sorry, not fetch, that's MySQL real escape string, and then we just put email back into that. And we do exactly the same thing with password. So I'll just copy and paste that down to save a bit of time. So we write password. Okay, so oh, in actual fact, we don't actually need to do that because we are converting the password again to an MD5 hash, much like we did when we registered the user. And obviously, if we convert anything to an MD5 hash, we're left with a 32-character string. And in that case, SQL injection won't be possible, whatever they enter as the password. So we can simply go ahead and create a new variable called login query, and this is going to be equal to the MySQL query function, and the SQL query inside of here is going to be select count, and we're counting the user ID, much like we did when we checked down here for the fact the user exists. But this time what we're doing is we're selecting count again from users, and the condition will be that the email is equal to the email, or an email inside of the table is equal to an email that we've supplied, and the password is also equal to the password that we supplied. But because we're hashing it, it will automatically convert it and make that check for us. So instead of saying select count, we need to select this as a field. So I'm going to say select count as, and I'm going to choose to select it as count, and that way we can reference this as a field that we'd normally select. So if you don't understand that quite yet, you'll get the hang of that later. What we also need to select is user ID, so user underscore ID, because we need to be able to put that into a session, and this login check function will return that. Now the condition is where email is equal to the email that's supplied by our user, so that's email, and we also need to check where the password is equal to password. However, we need to use the MD5 function on this to create a hash from it. So we just end there and concatenate that on, and then we concatenate the rest of the string. We can then just enclose this password variable in this MD5 function. Okay, so that's going to return a count, assuming that the count is greater than 0, i.e. it's 1. It's always going to be 1 because remember, we don't allow multiple email addresses to be registered. We select the count, which is user ID, and that's just going to select that and name it count, and we also select the user ID, so we can return that. Now what we want to do is we want to again create an inline or a one line or a single line if statement, but we want to say return, and the condition that we're returning it on is that MySQL result of login query, and remember selecting the first row, which is row 0, if that's equal to 1, means that we have a correct username and password combination. So if I was to type alex@phpacademy.org and my password as password, we hash the password, the plain text password, and that compares that to the value in the database. Now if either of one of them don't match, that means this value here that I'm highlighting here will be returned as 0, therefore it won't equal to 1. So if it does equal 1, we want to return the MySQL result, and that's going to be again of the login query. So we're grabbing a result, row 0, but this time is specifying to return user ID. So this function, if we do have a match, returns the user ID. That's essentially what this part is doing. Otherwise we want to return false, and this just means that the login check has failed and the user can't be logged in. So if we go back over to login.php, if this login variable here is equal to false, that means that this login check could not be processed. If it returns a numerical value, so an integer, it means that the function has passed a value because the query was a success, and it did return the value 1. So let's go ahead and echo this out and see what we get. So we've completed the function now. We just have to go over to our browser and refresh the page. I'm going to just enter anything, so I could just type in, say, alex@phpacademy.org, and let's just put a random password. So I'm just going to type ABC. When I click log in, nothing comes up because the query has failed. However, let's go ahead and type in the correct credentials, so alex@phpacademy.org, and my password, which is just password. I click log in and it returns the value 2. And if we look in the database, the user ID that corresponds to the credentials that I just typed in is actually 2. And if we did the same with bob@phpacademy.org, we should have a 9 returned. So as long as we test this correctly and we know what's being returned, in that case we are able to log the user in correctly. So you can see I've just typed that in there and returned a 9. So now we can take this login variable that's in our login.php file, and we can actually use this to compare inside of our error checks. So let's go ahead down here and we can say if login is equal to false, meaning the function returned false, we can add something else to the errors array, and that's going to be equal to unable to log you in. Okay, so just a simple message to say that the username and password were incorrect. Okay, so that's all the checks that we need to do. What we're going to do now is under here again, we're going to create an if statement to check if the errors variable is empty or not. So we can say if not empty errors, we can log user in. Otherwise, we want to return these errors. When in actual fact, no, if not empty means we return the errors. So again, we use a for each statement, and we come over here and we say for each errors as error, and we can just echo out error and then append a break onto that. So let's go ahead and just say echo OK here. That's just assuming that the username and password combination was correct and we have no other validation errors, and otherwise we're going to return an error here. So let's go ahead and just type in something silly. So well, we have to type an email address in here because obviously we have HTML5 validating our input. I'm just going to type a random password and it says unable to log you in. Now let's go ahead and type alex@phpacademy.org and type in my actual password, which is just password, click login, and it says OK. So where we are actually echoing out OK, we're actually going to log the user in. So essentially all we need to do is just set the session as we did in our register.php file. So $_session, remember we called it user ID, that is going to be equal to, and remember we returned the value from this login function, we returned the user ID, so we can essentially just set that to login, okay, because this returns the user ID.